Looks like the majority of the folks who are joining are in, so let me welcome you again to this session. And for those of you that had the opportunity to join this morning or join some of the webinars yesterday, I hope you're finding the information extremely useful and coming away with little nuggets of aha and good information around the future of QMS requirements. And so this session is going to be QMS from a regulatory perspective. And I would like to welcome Carmen Brown. This session will last about 45 minutes. We'd like to spend about 10 minutes at the end or so, at least 10 minutes at the end, allotted for your questions. So please do not hesitate to put your questions into the Q&A box, and we will get to them at the end of Carmen's presentation. So, quick introduction about Carmen. She currently serves as the Regulatory Affairs Manager at Proxima Clinical Research, a contract research organization that serves innovative drug and medical device and the medical device industry. Prior to Proxima, Carmen served as the QC Stability Coordinator for a biopharmaceutical company where she designed and managed a robust stability program. She has led the quality process improvement team and assisted in regulatory findings. Carmen has also served in additional stability coordination roles where she was a qualified trainer and assistant in the ANDA regulatory submissions. So Carmen also has held roles as QC analyst, where she performed routine and non-routine testing on QC samples, gaining experience in method development, validation, and CGMP. So with that, Carmen, how about I turn it over to you and we can get started.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the introduction. I guess that kind of takes away from me going through it. But like Mark said, I'm Carmen Brown. I'm a Regulatory Affairs Manager at Proxima Clinical Research. My background originally is in chemistry, and then I spent some time in the pharmaceutical industry on the quality side. Stability kind of lives within that quality assurance, quality control realm of companies. And now I kind of work more on the regulatory side these days, but I've seen both sides of the story. So today we're kind of going to talk about QMS and why it's the backbone of regulatory through the lens of ISO 13485. So it's going to cover the importance of a quality management system, timing, examine, a common obstacle that I see, which is quality versus regulatory, and when you should start developing that QMS, and then we'll kind of give a brief overview of ISO 13485, the 5 sections, and kind of how you integrate regulatory strategy into quality. So let's start at the beginning, as all good stories do. What is a QMS? It's a quality management system that's defined as a formal system that documents the structure, processes, roles, and responsibilities and procedures required to achieve the effective quality management. Essentially, it helps the company meet its regulatory requirements. So who needs a QMS? All manufacturers of a class 1 or class 2 or class 3 medical devices, sometimes a class 1, depending on the end goal, but essentially class 2 and 3 medical devices need a QMS. Okay, so let's dive into this misconception that I see with clients a lot, which is that you have to choose one or the other as like a first step. And I think I'm going to be honest, until probably about a year ago, I would have said choose regulatory first. There's a lot of questions that need to be addressed with different regulatory authorities, and doing so is daunting, and developing a pre-submission meeting packet or a pre-IND meeting packet, there's a lot that goes into it, and it's really essential to develop kind of your end goal so that you as a company can say we're pursuing a particular regulatory pathway, and that can be the driver. But we kind of have to back up and look at what the end goal truly is, and that a regulatory submission isn't the end goal. The end goal is really to have a device that can be sold, and regulatory only gets you so far. And I get the, the fear with regulatory is that, you're trying to pursue a particular pathway. And oftentimes that means, you're trying to pursue a 510K because de novos and PMAs are expensive and scary. And I get there's a lot of questions around it. And then when you look at when you're going to engage a CRO to develop a regulatory strategy, the cost associated with that and the delivery time to do that is often a lot faster. It's cheaper. It's a way to kind of get your bearings and get your foot in the door. And then if you compare it to quality, the delivery time's on the order of months, not weeks. We're talking 10K versus 50K. Like, that's a lot of money. It's a hard sell. Like, I get it. And so going back to that end in mind of your end goal is to have a device that you can sell, quality is really where you need to start. Because otherwise you're, building as many devices as you want according to the regulations, and you're basically stacking them up in the parking lot. Doesn't do you any good. So that leads us to ISO 13485. Kind of backing up again, what is ISO? ISO is an international standard that specifies the requirements for a quality management system. In the United States, this is regulated by 21 CFR Part 820, but outside of the United States, we operate a little differently, and it's required to conform to ISO 13485, which is the standard. So think of like Europe, Canada, Australia, places like that. So it may make more sense if you're looking at, from a strategic standpoint, you want to sell outside of the United States, to build to ISO first and then fill in the gaps to 820 rather than try to build to ISO later. And that's kind of where we're going to talk about today, and we'll dive a little bit deeper. In terms of regulatory strategy, I think where we get lost is you have to design, it feels like you have to design the device first to go through the regulatory pathway and determine that regulatory strategy. But if we look at the section of ISO 13485 where you actually design the product, it's product realization. And I know the numbers are off on this slide, but it's actually section 7 because ISO is numbered a little weird. And it's product realization, and that's where your design control activities actually happen. And notice it's not section 1. It's not at the beginning, and it's not at the beginning for a reason. And it's because you have to develop all of these prior layers of how you're going to document it, how are you going to control the product, who's going to control the product, and who's going to be responsible for every element of those design control activities. And thinking back to the goal is to have a product you can sell. Well, in order to sell a medical device, you have to have a design history file, which is that bottom layer of this pyramid here, that has your quality records, your design history file, your design history records that really allow you to sell a medical device. But it's the bottom of the pyramid. We have to do all of these other components first that are woven into sections 1 through 3 of ISO 13485. So that's kind of where you have to start with the QMS first, and then regulatory will come as you develop all of these other things. But let's dive a little bit more into each section as we go. So quality management system. So this is section 4, which is actually the first section that really dives into the details of what is actually entailed in a quality management system. And this is a really broad section of the standard that kind of outlines how you're going to document everything, what you're going to document, how you're going to control those documents. It's basically the what and how of everything that comes later. The section I really want to point out is this medical device file, which includes the description of product, the intended use, your indications for use, labeling, specifications, and things like that. This is really the foundation for where we launch the regulatory standard, regulatory strategy, and regulatory research. This is where we begin, usually. So all of those documentation requirements preceding that launching of the regulatory strategy are really critical to kind of understand what comes later. And that's why starting with the QMS first before you get to regulatory is really important. And it's not this one road to the other. Think of them as like two roads walking parallel. But if you start on QMS too late, you may never get back on. It's really hard. So management responsibility, section 5. This is kind of goes back into the who will do all of the activities that come in your design control, particularly the customer focus section. Because from an altruistic standpoint, you're not developing a medical device for nothing. It's for some purpose, and it's for a person that's ultimately going to use this. And that has to be at the forefront of everything that comes later. And ultimately, that's the forefront of the regulatory strategy as well as the QMS. We have to think about who's going to be using it. What setting are they going to be using it in? What are the risks associated with that person using the device? Because the risks of a pediatric user versus an adult are significantly different. And we have to establish that from the beginning. And that's where this section comes in of like identifying how you're going to keep the customer at the focus of all of the quality components of your QMS. And then from there, you develop the policy of, all of your procedures and things that come that will ultimately bring it back to that customer focus. And management is at the forefront of that because ultimately it's their responsibility to make sure that that happens. Okay, so this is a little bit more about what each of the sections are in this section. It's based on 4 main components, which is the quality policy, QMS planning, executive management, and a management review. Quality policy, like I talked about, is key to ensuring effectiveness of your QMS. It basically outlines management's commitment to quality and the purpose of the organization, which is to provide a medical device for the customer. And make sure that that's understood throughout the customer, throughout the company. QMS planning is kind of going along that line of like, how are you going to execute that quality policy? And it's important to identify and define those quality objectives as your regulations evolve. It also kind of addresses how are you going to update your QMS as the regulations evolve, because you may start out thinking that you're pursuing one regulatory pathway, but that may change as your device changes, as the design changes. So how are you going to effectively go back and improve those quality policies and objectives as it evolves? Executive management, again, is ensures that the roles and responsibilities of the QMS are defined, of who is going to be conducting those activities and how are they going to be conducted, such that there's a management representative ensuring that everything is done. And then a management review. So it's done at least once per year to establish the company's quality culture. It's also ensuring that all of your design control activities are conducted appropriately and go back to that quality policy and those quality objectives. So it's like an internal verification. And going hand in hand with that is resource management. So we've identified from a management responsibility perspective of, how is everything going to get done? Now this answers the question of who is going to do it. And do we have enough resources to make sure that that can happen? The one section I want to call out here is this contamination control in section 6.4.2, because this is a big question that we get a lot when it comes to sterility of medical devices. And I think this is a common question we see in pre-submissions of, do we have to label the device as sterile? What testing do we have to do to make that claim? And that, kind of drives us on the regulatory side. But if we've gotten through section 4 and 5 and 6, we can kind of address this question now. But if you've started with your regulatory, you may get all the way through that first pre-sub and then go back and be developing your QMS system and get to this section 6.4.2. And now you have to go back and do rework and understand what the requirements are at that point. You may miss this opportunity to ask this question in that initial pre-sub, or address this. Or worst case scenario, you get all the way to developing your submission and writing the submission, and then you realize this is the question. If we look at this figure here, which is taken directly from the eStar, which is how the submissions are written for 510Ks and de novos, it's a question right there in the first section of the document of the device description of, is the device packaged as sterile? And what does that mean? Is it a single-use non-sterile device? Is it terminally sterilized? There are questions associated with that. And depending on how you answer those, it auto-populates, later sections within the document. So, God forbid you started the regulatory strategy first, you've had all these interactions, and now you're building your QMS and going, oh crap, we missed an opportunity. Or, we labeled it wrong and we submitted, and now we have a hold on the submission and a limited time frame to address this question with FDA. So that's kind of an important question to ask early on. All right, so the meat of the standard, product realization. This is the good stuff. This is what everyone really thinks of when they think of design controls, and comparing ISO to CFR Part 820. This is where the magic happens. And this is where a lot of the questions from a regulatory perspective come about, of, the risk management questions. I think the number one question I see in early regulatory interactions is the verification and validation plan. And what's the testing associated with that? How do we go about figuring that out? And I struggle with that, honestly, from a regulatory question, because it really should come from you as a manufacturer, as a developer. You should be the one determining how are you going to verify that the device is safe and effective and meets the claims of your intended use statement. But if you start with the regulatory, I can see how those questions are seemingly unanswerable. And there's a way that we can go about answering them to some extent, but they really should come from your design control process. And up to this point, you've kind of established how you're going to document things, what you're going to document, but now we need to get into the process of planning, okay, based on the customer, based on the intended user, what are the risks? What are the verification needs to ensure that all of our design inputs are met based on those user needs? And really creating those records that ultimately provide the evidence for your regulatory submission. And so that's where section 7.1 and 7.2, that product planning of product realization and customer related processes really come into play. So if you've developed your QMS first, and then now we can start really getting into the meat of the regulatory submission, it may be seemingly like you put a pause on QMS while you answer these regulatory questions, rather than getting through the regulatory interaction and then having to go back and do sections 4 through 6. Because that's rework. I always want to avoid rework. If I've learned anything in my years in quality, that's like the worst thing in the world, is having to redo something if you didn't do it right the first time. And then, even saving you more time, section 7.3, where we get into the actual design and development, and design controls, we look at comparatively to our regulatory submission, in this figure is again taken directly from the eStar. You can see how those get plopped right into the submission itself. Those design control activities get inserted right into that regulatory submission. That risk management and risk mitigation table you develop in section 7.1 gets plopped right into the submission. So you're saving yourself a lot of time down the road by having started this QMS first. And it's from an efficiency standpoint. I think it also raises a lot of questions that you can address, before you get to that regulatory point, and really serves as providing those records ahead of time that ultimately serve as the evidence for your device. All right. Lastly, measurement, analysis, and improvement. So I think there's this misnotion that a QMS system is something that you develop that's stagnant. You do it once and you're done, especially with like the beginning foundational SOPs, like your design and development plan, your document control SOP, you write it and then it's done. But the reality is that a QMS is an ever evolving continual process. It will always be updated. It will always be moving, shifting. It's a continuum, it's not a stagnant process. It's a system for a reason. And that's what this last section really talks about, is how are you doing all of those ongoing efforts? Reporting to the regulatory authorities can mean multiple different things, depending on the agency, depending on what is happening, depending on your device. It may mean reporting an adverse event during a clinical trial. It may mean reporting a complaint. It may mean, a letter to file because you changed something that's not significant enough to warrant a new submission. Or it may mean a new submission because this change was significant. It's also how are you going to handle the day-to-day aspect of everything, of the complaint handling, the internal audits, the ongoing stability. Maybe you're doing post-approval studies that are, more in the monitoring and measurement of the product and the processes. But it's this continuous look back and review on everything that you've already built up to this point, and how are you going to handle it. And then also goes into this analysis of data of, okay, the device is out there in the market, it's out there in the world, and we're continuously coming in and collecting data. What are we going to do with it? What does that mean? And that goes back to those product requirements that you set in previous sections of continuously updating those. I see a lot of that as a stability coordinator. You don't know a lot about the drug going in, or about the device, or you've set the stability parameters at a certain point based on the knowledge that you have at the time. But as you get updates, you get to know that. Think of, for example, of the Mirena device was recently updated to be good for 8 years rather than 5. That's where this came in. They had continual stability data to be able to change those product requirements and conduct those activities. But ultimately at this point, we've made this transition from quality and regulatory being those two parallel roads that I talked about earlier to being, one path together. They've merged. And from this point forward, it's really quality informing regulatory activities. But that ultimately that quality was the foundation that you started with from the beginning. And regulatory walked alongside and eventually got on the train. I know it's mixing metaphors, but that's really where we are at this point. So that's an overview of ISO and kind of integrating that regulatory strategy into building of your QMS. I know I really fast and covered a lot of information, but looking forward to questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Carmen. Yeah. A lot of great information there. And let me just remind folks, if there are questions, please dump them into the Q&A section. And I am going to run through those for you, Carmen, and fire them off at you. And I see also that somebody raised their hand. I'm not sure if that was just inadvertently or if there's somebody that has a question. And if they do, please put it into the chat section, and we'll get to it that way. So here's a question from David. I never worked for a company that had a generic quality plan, and I don't know what it would say. I have, and I don't even know what it would say. I have used and written quality plans to address larger scale problems, and to that explain the problem and how we're going to tackle it. Their notified body loved that idea, and otherwise they don't really intend to have a document in the QMS called a quality plan. What's your reaction? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's really hard. And the reality is the standard makes it out to seem like this quality policy should be this big, generic, overarching thing. And you're right, David, it shouldn't be. It should be, anticipatory of all of the problems you expect to face and how you're going to address them. And it's way more specific than I think the standard makes it out to be. And that's where I think a lot of people get tripped up. But you're absolutely correct. It should not be, generic and overarching. It should be very specific and focused to your device and the problems you expect to tackle.
Good. Second question then. With regards to management responsibility, what are your thoughts about who should be the management rep of the company? And is it acceptable to change this resource right before the notified body audit, even when this person did not implement the quality management system? Oh, sounds like somebody's got a real experience there living there.
Yeah,
Good question.
I sense some fear there. I think that really depends on the company and the size of the company. Ultimately, management responsibility is, I guess, relative to the size of the company. Because I think when we're talking in the startup world, oftentimes you wear, various different hats at multiple different times. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be, a dedicated person that's always that through the beginning. Just because you're the CEO doesn't mean you can't also be the, the head of engineering and things like that. I would say probably not changing it right before the audit with the notified body. Especially if they don't have the history. What's important to remember is backing up the role with the training and knowledge required for that role, especially when it comes to management responsibility. So the associate level that doesn't have the experience, probably not going to be the one that's signing off on those finalized documents. You really want to be able to back up with training and experience. And a lot of times those notified bodies, ask for those CVs, ask for the training records, and they want to know that the person is functioning in a role that they're capable of functioning in.
Yeah, great points. Just maybe as a follow-up to that kind of question, not so much about the management rep, but along the management commitment. And a lot of startup or smaller medical device companies, the CEO of the company might not be the expert in QMS or regulatory affairs, and may not understand or appreciate the importance as you've described it here. What recommendations or hints would you have about how to gain management commitment and not always be pushing upwards to try to get things done?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the balance of the CEO is always driving that timeline. Personally, I would say recommend engaging, someone that does, and that's kind of where building that infrastructure comes in, and human resources aspect of ensuring that you have the right people to do everything you need to do. So if the CEO doesn't understand, the importance of a QMS and how to go about that and every day-to-day activities of that, he needs to engage someone that does, and ensure that provision of resources is there. And selfishly, from a Proxima standpoint, I would say engage a CRO. It's always a good idea.
Gotcha. As company infrastructure changes, how can the RA and QMS systems adopt to the company as the company is growing in numbers as well? Is there a strategy you can set as a flexible foundation so that your EQMS and RA strategy can evolve in complexity or scale and growth?
That's a great question. Love that. So we plan for change. So I think a lot of the foundational documents that you build in, let me go back to like the quality manual and work instructions, and making sure that those are clear such that, you know, someone coming in later down the line, brand spanking new, you know, can read those instructions and those drawings and understand, you know, what has been done, and you build that training. But one of the foundational elements too is then that you develop a training matrix and an authority matrix of, you know, who's signing off on what training is required to be able to sign off on those things. And that's constantly evolving, and written into your foundational elements that it's constantly evolving. There is not this expectation that even like your quality manuals stagnant. Those will get updated as you go, and ultimately updated as you learn things. So for example, say if you got all the way through, you know, building your QMS thinking that you're a 510K, and you get through some regulatory interactions and understand that, okay, now we're pursuing a de novo. There's some different things that have to happen. That product realization really has to grow. You know, maybe we need to go back and look at those 3 sections to understand what changed from that. So it's ultimately, as you get through each step, constantly evaluating back of what changed, what needs to evolve from there. Just continuous improvement is the idea.
Gotcha. Let's see. So there's a couple folks that are asking about whether slides are available. So I can take that one. Yes, they will be. The presentation will be available to you. And actually, I will put the link in the chat right now. So if you click on the chat icon there, I put the link to the presentation. But you'll get information after the presentation on how to access the presentation and any materials. Let's see, what are your thoughts on the same person handling both quality and regulatory tasks at a company? Another good one.
Yeah, it's a very good one. And honestly, very common. I see it kind of all the time, especially in, you know, in startup world, as we like to say, because you wear, you know, multiple hats. From a quality management system, the biggest point to distinguish is that person responsible for document control. Because that ultimately has to be separate. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the quality and regulatory person can't also be document control, but then you need to have someone else that can sign in between, because document control needs to be your last signature. So kind of outlining out, especially if you're a small company, you know, who's going to function as that final signatory in that document control capacity. So it's not impossible. It can be done. It's just a little bit more strategic.
Let's see, what other good questions? We already talked about it. There's another question regarding the quality plan. Maybe, let me throw it out there because maybe it's asked just a little bit differently enough. Seems to be a hot topic. So would I can maybe it's looking more for confirmation. So would you have a document called a quality plan? They have a quality policy and quality objectives, just not a quality plan. Does that capture it?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that is really kind of I think the quality plan is more of your quality manual. And that's really how I see it. And that's the foundational document. That's that kind of the overarching thing. But again, specific to your device and to your company, and to your problems that you're, you know, tackling. But I think that that quality plan is really that quality manual.
Gotcha. So there's a few other questions about quality plans. That is a hot topic. We've got a question here from a company with a class 1 device. So let me ask the question this way: is a QMS required for companies who have a class 1 device? And is there any specific recommendations for that QMS?
Yeah, so that depends on the regulatory pathway associated with it. So a class 1 medical device is just a lower risk associated with it. So like a Band-Aid is a class 1 medical device. You know, toothbrush, those types of things, but they're lower risk associated with it. So it really depends on the regulatory strategy and pathway. And I think this is one scenario where I would argue that it's better to start with regulatory first, to kind of identify and rule out those things if you think you are a class 1, because if you're 510K exempt, there's that line that you may have to walk. You know, just because a QMS isn't required of you doesn't mean it's not a good idea anyways. It's too. But, it's a lot of money to spend down if you don't have that process. And even if a QMS is not required, you're still required to do all of those testing and verification processes, especially for audit scenarios. So it may not hurt to have one anyways. But it really depends on what the regulatory pathway is.
Okay. Do most QMS systems today have to take into consideration the compliance with CFR Part 11 and PICS as a standard?
Yes. And I think most of that is built in, especially if you pick like a EQMS system like Greenlight Guru or Kaleo. I think that's built in pretty standard. But yes, Part 11 is a requirement.
So here's an interesting question about Proxima. So your company, as a clinical research company, does need a certificate under ISO 13485. Why?
So we are ISO 13485 is conjunction with ISO 9001. And they kind of go hand in hand. So the 9001 is like this overarching umbrella that 13485 falls under. And so we have to conform to that. And that kind of gets us to the 13485.
Yeah, and I can add as another good example, Greenlight Guru. 98% of our customers think that we're a medical device company and therefore certified to 13485. And the fact is that we're not. We're a software development company. Our customers happen to be 100% in the medical or in the med tech space, let's say, but we ourselves are not a medical device company. So our management internal quality systems are certified to ISO 9001, and that fits the scope of the activities that are going on within our company. It would take a notified body about 45 minutes to come in and conduct into their audit to realize that we're not fulfilling the scope of ISO 13485 and that we're sort of barking up the wrong tree. So yeah, good response. What is the rationale for separating doc control from quality? Is it for audit purposes?
Yep. And I mean, it's not sort of separating doc control from quality, it's separating doc control from regulatory. So if you're, because that's that final signature. So theoretically, you could have quality sign on a document and then a different person sign as regulatory, and then that quality person signs again as doc control. Because doc control falls under the quality head, but it's more if you're going to have QA and RA function together, you need to have some distinction between doc control and regulatory.
Yeah, so now we got a lot of quick fire questions here. This is good. What are your thoughts on regulatory's approval of procedures if quality and regulatory functions are separate? Is it needed?
It depends on the procedure. And that's kind of where that goes into that authority matrix that I talked about earlier of like who's going to sign off on what and who's needed to sign off on what, because it really depends on what the procedure is. On a software development plan, I don't know, the regulatory really needs to be, distinct from quality in that perspective because they're kind of functioning more in that quality role. But, on a regulatory plan, absolutely, you need to have that RA signature be distinct because they're functioning more in that regulatory capacity. So it's looking at, if you're going to have people wear those multiple hats, what hat are they wearing as the primary for that particular document that they're approving? And that may change, throughout the different documents that you have in your QMS. And it may evolve as the company grows, as you add people, you may not have to ask that question down the road, because when you started, quality and regulatory functioning together, but now that you've grown, you have that distinct quality and regulatory signature that you didn't have before.
Yeah. Also, there's been a lot of questions regarding the management representative, and I think you've done a fairly good job of answering most of them. But again, here's one's just a little bit different. So I'll toss it out there. It's probably a quick answer. In the absence of a quality manager or director, can a quality engineer be appointed by top management as the management rep?
As long as they have the training associated with that and, experience to back that role up, absolutely.
Good. In regards to Part 11, again, electronic signatures, a lot of companies that are paper-based and decide to go remote due to COVID or whatever, started using software like Adobe Electronic Signature to sign documents. Is that acceptable?
Yes, as Adobe has a Part 11 compliant signature capabilities. And so that's, and not editable documents after it's signed, who signed and for what reason and when they signed is listed at the bottom of the signature. So my understanding is that's fine as long as it's capable and compliant.
Okay, let's see. So some of them are long. I liked those short ones.
The long ones are good ones. They get into
let's see, we were just talking 21 CFR Part 11. Our company uses certain systems which are used to store interim documents before they are finally published in the EQMS. Are we required to meet 21 CFR requirements, 21 CFR Part 11 requirements on those interim systems? And are they required to be validated as well per CFR requirements?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And I think kind of goes back into I think of the example of using Greenlight Guru of your kind of offline editing those documents, and you have the system that controls all of these offline things and until they're published. And my understanding is that until they're published and effective, they're not real. They may as well not exist. But I would not recommend necessarily signing them and storing them, in a manner that's uncontrolled. So that, anyone off the street can come in and edit those documents. And you're making sure that your system of putting them into the official, publishing process is adherent to Part 11 and the guidelines you set out in your QMS system.
Here's an interesting question. I won't bias it by saying I have not seen this myself. I don't think it's possible, but how about a med tech company outsourcing the entire QMS to a different supplier / to a different company? Does that kind of scenario exist? Are there any examples?
It absolutely does. And I see it all the time. And just because you outsource the task does not mean you outsource the responsibility. And that question comes up a lot, especially at a CRO of, someone else outside of your organization is developing your system for you, and maybe even documenting the day-to-day activities within the system. But ultimately, you as a company are still responsible for ensuring that system is effective, and that it conforms to the standard in which you say it does, or it complies at a minimum to Part 820.
Let's see, got an eye on the clock here. I think we'll toss out one. We got time for one more question. We got a lot still to choose from. And for those of you who questions we do not get to, all of the questions will be forwarded to Carmen. So if there's any questions that we didn't have time to get to, give her an opportunity to respond. Let's see, one more.
Feel free to reach out. My email's on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me via email. Happy to set up a call and talk further.
One last question. Our organization is in the development stage of a Class 2 device. Are we required to complete the quality manual at this stage, or can we wait until we finish up the device?
So I think that's the heart of what I was talking about with this presentation of, there's this misconception of let's develop the device first and get through this regulatory pathway and then go back. So you're not required to. I would at this point. Because I think it makes, things as you move forward easier rather than having to go back. And now you have all this device that you've designed that's effectively sitting in a parking lot, and FDA is not going to let it in the door, or Health Canada is not going to let it in the door.
Yeah. Gotcha. All right. We are at time. Carmen, thank you so much. Fantastic presentation. Great questions, everybody. Really appreciate your participation. I'd like to just, by way of reminder, that we do have a survey that's up and running. And if you participate in the survey, your opportunity to win some big bucks I put a link in the chat to the survey, so please, if you have a couple of minutes, click on that link and take the survey for us. And so that's it for us. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back at the top of the hour to look into the future of the FDA's quality management systems regulation. Carmen, thank you again so much.
Thank you all. Bye.